Hello, nightmares, and welcome back to another video. I want to apologize in advance. My voice is still a little bit cracky from being sick last week, but I'm doing better, and I'm finally going to read a little bit more of Interview with the Vampire for you. There might be some cuts and a little bit of weird editing, but it's because of traffic, or I'm just genuinely trying to catch my breath because I'm still a little sick. So, how are you doing? How has your week been? I really hope you're doing well. So, we're gonna get right into it. This is my bookmark of choice. But would he have let you go? Asked the boy, under any circumstances. I don't know. Knowing Lestat as I do now, I would say he would have killed me rather than let me go. But this was what I wanted, you see. It didn't matter, no. This is what I thought I wanted, and as soon as we reached the house, I jumped down out of the carriage, and I walked a zombie to the brick stairs where my brother had fallen. The house had been unoccupied for months now, the overseer having his own cottage, and the Louisiana heat and damp were already picking apart the steps. Every crevice was sprouting grass, and even the small wildflowers. I remember feeling the moisture, which in the night was cool as I sat down on the lower steps and even rested my head against the brick. And I felt the little wax-stemmed wildflowers with my hands. And I pulled a clump of them out of the easy dirt in one hand. I want to die. Kill me. Kill me, I said to the vampire. Now I am guilty of murder. I can't live. And he sneered with the impatience of people listening to the obvious lies of others. And then in a flash, he fastened on me, just as he had on my man. And I thrashed against him wildly, and I dug my boot into his chest, and I kicked him as fiercely as I could. His teeth stinging my throat, and the fever pounding in my temples. And with the movement of his entire body, much too fast for me to see, I was suddenly standing disdainfully at the foot of the steps. I thought you wanted to die, Louis, he said. The boy made a soft, abrupt sound when the vampire said his name, which the vampire acknowledged with a quick statement, yes, that is my name, and went on. Well, I lay there helpless in the face of my own cowardice and fatuousness again, he said, perhaps so directly confronted with it that I might in time have gained the courage to truly take my life, not to whine and beg for others to take it. I saw myself turning a knife then, languishing in a day-to-day suffering which I found as necessary as penance from the confessional. Truly hoping death would find me, unawares and render me fit for the eternal pardon. And I also saw myself, as if in a vision, standing at the head of the stairs, just where my brother had stood, and then hurtling my body down on the bricks. But there was no time for courage, or shall I say, there was no time in Lestat's plan for anything but his plan. "Now listen to me, Louis," he said, and he lay down beside me now on the steps. Movement so graceful and so personal that at once it made me think of a lover, and I recoiled. But he put his right arm around me, and he pulled me close to his chest. Never had I been this close to him before, and in the dim light I could see the magnificent radiance of his eye and the unnatural mask of skin. And I tried to move, and he pressed his right fingers against my lips and said, "Be still. I'm going to drain you now to the very threshold of death, and I want you to be quiet, so quiet that you could almost hear the flow of blood through your veins, so quiet that you could hear the flow of that same blood through mine. It is your consciousness, your will, which I must keep you alive." I wanted to struggle, but he pressed so hard with his fingers that he held my entire prone body in check. And as soon as I stopped my abortive attempt at rebellion, he sank his teeth into my neck. The boy's eyes grew huge. He had drawn farther and farther back in his chair as the vampire spoke. And now his face was tense and his eyes narrow, as if he were preparing to weather a blow. "Have you ever lost a great amount of blood?" asked the vampire. "Do you know the feeling?" The boy's lips shaped the word "no," but no sound came out. He cleared his throat. "No," he said. The candles burned in the upstairs parlor where he had planned the death of the overseer. An oil lantern swayed in the breeze on the gallery, and all of this light coalesced and began to shimmer as through a golden presence hovered above me, suspended in the stairwell, softly entangled with the railings, curling and contracting like smoke. "Listen, keep your eyes wide," Lestat whispered to me, his lips moving against my neck, and I remember the movement of his lips raised the hair all over my body, sent a shock of sensation through my body that was not unlike the pleasure of passion. He mused, his right finger slightly curled beneath his chin, and the first finger appearing to lightly stroke it. The result was that within minutes I was weak to paralysis, panic-stricken. I discovered I could not even will myself to speak. Lestat still held me, of course, and his arm was like the weight of an iron bar, and I felt his teeth withdraw with such a keenness that the 2 puncture wounds seemed somehow enormous, lined with pain. And now he bent over my helpless head, and taking his right hand off me, he bit his own wrist. The blood flowed down upon my shirt and coat, and he watched it with a narrow, gleaming eye, and it seemed an eternity that he watched it, and that shimmer of light now hung behind his head like the backdrop of an apparition. I think that I knew what he meant to do even before he did it. And I was waiting in my helplessness as I'd been waiting for years. He pressed his bleeding wrist to my mouth, said firmly and a little impatiently, "Louis, drink." And I did. "Steady, Louis, and hurry." He whispered to me a number of times, and I drank, sucking the blood out of the holes, experiencing for the first time since infancy the special pleasure of sucking nourishment. The body focused with the mind upon one vital source, and then something happened. The vampire sat back, a slight frown on his face. "How pathetic is it to describe these things which we cannot truly be described," he said, his voice low, almost to a whisper, and the boy sat as if frozen. I saw nothing but that light then as I drew blood, and then this next thing. This next thing was sound. A dull roar at first, and then a pounding, like the pounding of a drum, growing louder and louder, as if some enormous creature were coming up on one slowly. Through a dark and alien forest, pounding as he came, a huge drum, and then there came the pounding of another drum, as if another giant was coming yards behind him, and each giant, intent on its own drum, gave no notice to the rhythm of the other. And the sound grew louder and louder, until it seemed to fill not just my hearing, but all of my senses. To be throbbing in my lips and fingers, in the flesh of my temples, and in my veins, and above all, my heart. My veins, the drum, and then another drum, and then Lestat pulled his wrist free, suddenly. And I opened my eyes, and I checked myself in a moment of reaching for his wrist, grabbing it, forcing it back to my mouth at all cost. I checked myself because I realized that the drum was my heart, and the second drum had been his, and the vampire sighed. "Do you understand?" The boy began to speak, and then shook his head. "No, I do," he said. Of course," said the vampire, looking away. Wait, the boy said in a welter of excitement, "and the tape is almost gone. I have to turn it over." And the vampire watched patiently as he changed it. "What happened then?" the boy asked, and his face was moist, and he wiped it hurriedly with his handkerchief. "I saw as a vampire," said the vampire, his voice now slightly detached, and it seemed almost distracted. And then he drew himself up. Lestat was standing again at the foot of the stairs, and I saw him as I couldn't possibly have seen him before. I'm gonna pause real quick. A train just came by, and I don't know if I read that line or not, but if I did and I repeated it twice, I'm sorry. Okay. He had seemed white to me before, starkly white, so that in the night he was almost luminous, and now I saw him, filled with his own life and own blood. He was radiant, not luminous, and then I saw that not only Lestat had changed, but all things had changed. It was as if I had just only been able to see colors and shapes for the first time. I was so enthralled with the buttons on Lestat's black coat that I looked at nothing else for a long time. And then Lestat began to laugh, and I heard his laughter as I had never heard anything before. His heart I still heard like the beating of a drum. And now came this metallic laughter. It was confusing. each sound running into the next sound like the mingling reverberations of bells, until I learned to separate the sounds, and they then overlapped, and each soft but distinct, increasing but discreet, peals of laughter, and the vampire smiled with delight. Peals of bells. Stop looking at my buttons, Lestat said. Go out there into the trees and rid yourself of all the human waste in your body. And don't fall so madly in love with the night that you lose your way. That, of course, was a wise command. When I saw the moon on the flagstones, I became so enamored with it that I must have spent an hour there, and I passed my brother's oratory without so much as a thought of him, and standing among the cottonwood and the oaks, I heard the night as if it were a chorus of whispering women, all beckoning me to their breasts. As for my body, it was not yet totally converted, and as soon as I became the least accustomed to the sights and sounds, it began to ache. All my human fluids were being forced out of me. I was dying as a human, yet completely alive as a vampire, and with my awakened senses, I had to preside over the death of my body with a certain discomfort, and then finally, fear. I ran back up the steps to the parlor where Lestat was already at work on the plantation papers, going over the expenses and profits of the last year. You're a rich man, he said to me as I came in. Something's happening to me, I shouted. You're dying, that's all. Don't be a fool. Don't you have any oil lamps? All this money, and you can't afford whale oil except that lantern. Bring me that lantern. Dying, I shouted. Dying? It happens to everyone, he persisted, refusing to help me. And as I look back on this, I still despise him for it. Not because I was afraid, but because he might have drawn my attention to those changes with reverence. He might have calmed me and told me I might watch my death with the same fascination which I had watched and felt that night, but he didn't. Lestat was never the vampire I am, not at all. The vampire did not say this boastfully. He said it as if he would truly have had it otherwise. Allures, he sighed. I was dying fast, which meant that my capacity for fear was diminishing as rapidly. I simply regret that I was not more attentive to the process. Lestat was being a perfect idiot. Oh, for the love of hell, he began shouting. Do you realize I've made no provision for you? What a fool I am. I was tempted to say, yes, you are, but I didn't. You'll have to bed down with me this morning. I haven't prepared you a coffin. And the vampire laughed. The coffin struck such a chord of terror in me that I think it absorbed all the capacity for the terror I had left. And then came only my mild alarm at having to share a coffin with Lestat. He was in his father's bedroom meantime, telling the old man goodbye, that he would return in the morning. But where do you go, and why must you live by such a schedule? And the old man demanded, and Lestat became impatient. Before this, he had been gracious to the old man, almost to the point of sickening one. But now he became a bully. I take care of you, don't I? I've put a better roof over your head than you ever put over mine. And if I want to sleep all day and drink all night, I'll do it, damn you. And the old man started to whine. Only my peculiar state of emotions and the unusual feeling of exhaustion kept me from disapproving. And I was watching the scene through the open door, enthralled with the colors of the counterpane and the positive riot of color over the old man's face. His blue veins pulsed beneath his pink and grayish flesh, and I found even the yellow of his teeth appealing to me, and I became almost hypnotized by the quivering of his lip. Such a son, he said, never suspecting, of course, the true nature of his son. All right, then go. I know you keep a woman somewhere. You go to see her as soon as her husband leaves in the morning. Give me my rosary. What has happened to my rosary? Lestat said something blasphemous and gave him the rosary. But the boy started. Yes, said the vampire. I'm afraid I don't allow you to ask enough questions. I was going to ask, rosaries have crosses on them, don't they? The rumor about crosses, the vampire laughed. You refer to our being afraid of crosses? Unable to look on them, I thought, said the boy. Nonsense, my friend, sheer nonsense. I can look on anything I like, and I like rather looking upon crucifixes in particular. And what about the rumor about keyholes, that you can become steam and go through them? I wish I could, laughed the vampire. How positively delightful. I should like to pass through all manner of different keyholes, and to feel the tickle of their particular shapes, no? He shook his head. That is how we would say it today. Bullshit. The boy laughed despite himself, and then his face grew serious. You mustn't be so shy with me, the vampire said. What is it? The story about the stakes through the heart, said the boy, his cheeks coloring slightly. The same, said the vampire. Bullshit. He said carefully, articulating both syllables, so that the boy smiled. No magical power whatsoever. Why don't you smoke one of your cigarettes? I see you have them in your shirt pocket. Oh, thank you, said the boy, as if it were a marvelous suggestion. But once he had the cigarette to his lips, his hands were trembling so badly that he mingled the first fragile book match. Allow me, said the vampire, and taking the book, he quickly put a match to the boy's cigarette, and the boy inhaled, and his eyes on the vampire's fingers. Now, the vampire withdrew across the table with a soft rustling of garments. There's an ashtray on the basin, he said to the boy, and he moved nervously to get it, and he stared at the few butts in it for a moment. And then, seeing the small wastebasket beneath, he emptied the ashtray and quickly set it on the table, and his fingers left the damp marks on the cigarette where he had put it down. Is this your room? He asked. No, the vampire answered. Just a room. What happened then? Asked the boy, and the vampire appeared to be watching the smoke gather beneath the overhead bulb. We went back to New Orleans post-haste, he said. Lestat had his coffin in a miserable room near the ramparts. And you did get into the coffin? I had no choice. I begged Lestat to let me stay in the closet, but he laughed, astonished. Don't you know what you are? He asked. But is it magical? Must it have this shape? I pleaded. Only to hear him laugh again, I couldn't bear the idea. But as we argued, I realized I had no real fear. It was a strange realization. All my life I feared closed places, born and bred in French houses with lofty ceilings and floor-length windows. I had a dread of being enclosed, and I felt uncomfortable, even in the confessional at church. It was a normal enough fear, and now I realized as I protested to Lestat, I not only did actually feel this anymore, I was simply remembering it, hanging on to it from habit, from a deficiency of ability to recognize my present and accelerating freedom. You're carrying on badly, Lestat said finally, and it's almost dawn. I should let you die. You will die, you know. The sun will destroy the blood I've given you in every tissue, every vein. But you shouldn't be feeling this fear at all. I think you're like a man who loses an arm or a leg and keeps insisting that he can feel pain. Where the arm or leg used to be, well, that was positively the most intelligent and useful thing Lestat had ever said in my presence, and it brought me around at once. Now, I'm getting into the coffin, and he finally said to me, this most disdainful tone, and you will get in on top of me, and if you know what's good for you. I did. I lie face down on him, utterly confused by my absence of dread, and filled with a distaste for the being so close to him. Handsome and intriguing though he was, and he shut the lid, and I asked him if I was completely dead. My body was tingling and itching all over. No, you're not then, he said. When you are, you'll only hear and see it changing and feel nothing. You should be dead by tonight. Go to sleep. Was he right? Were you dead when you woke up? Yes, changed, I should say. As obviously I'm still alive, my body was dead. It was some time before it became absolutely cleansed of all the fluids, and a matter of it no longer needed. But it was dead, and with the realization of it came another stage in my divorce from human emotions. The first thing which became apparent to me, even while Lestat and I were loading the coffin into a hearse, stealing another coffin from a mortuary, was that I did not like Lestat at all. I was far from being his equal yet, but I was infinitely closer to him than I had ever been before the death of my body, and I can't really make this clear to you for obvious reason, that you are now as I was before my body died. You cannot understand, but before I died, Lestat was absolutely the most overwhelming experience I'd ever had. Your cigarette has become one long cylindrical ash. Oh, the boy said quickly, and he ground the filter into the glass. You mean that when the gap was closed between you, he lost his spell? He asked, his eyes quickly fixed on the vampire, and his hands now producing a cigarette and match much more easily than before. Yes, that's correct, said the vampire with obvious pleasure. The trip back to Pt.2 was thrilling, and the consistent chatter of Lestat was positively the most boring and disheartening thing I experienced. And of course, as I said, I was far from being his equal. I had my dead limbs to contend with, to use his comparison, and I learned that on that very night when I had to make my first kill, the vampire reached across the table now, more brushed. Oh wait, I'm sorry. The vampire reached across the table now and gently brushed an ash from the boy's label. And the boy stared at his withdrawing hand in alarm. "Excuse me," said the vampire. "I didn't mean to frighten you." "Excuse me," said the boy. "I just got the impression suddenly that your arm was abnormally long. You reached so far without moving." "No," said the vampire, resting his hands again on his crossed knees. "I moved forward much too fast for you to see, and it was an illusion." "You moved forward? But you didn't. You were sitting just as you are now with your back against the chair." "No," repeated the vampire firmly. "I moved forward as I told you. Here, I'll do it again." And he did it again, and the boy stared with some mixture of confusion and fear. "You still didn't see it," said the vampire, "but you see, if you look at my outstretched arm now, it's really not remarkably long at all." And he raised his arm, first finger pointing heavenward, as if it were an angel about to give the word of the Lord. "You've experienced a fundamental difference between the way you see and I see. My gesture appeared slow and somewhat languid to me, and the sound of my finger brushing your coat was quite audible. Well, I don't mean to frighten you, I confess, but perhaps you can see from this that my return to Pt.2 was a feast of new experiences, the mere swaying of a tree branch in the wind and a delight." "Yes," said the boy. But he was still visibly shaken, and the vampire eyed him for a moment, and he said, "I was telling you about your first kill," said the boy. "Yes, I should say first, however, that the plantation was in a state of pandemonium. The overseer's body had been found, and so had the blind old man in the master bedroom, and no one could explain the blind old man's presence, and no one had been able to find me in New Orleans. My sister had contacted the police, and several of them were at Pt.2. When I arrived, I was already quite dark, naturally. It was already quite dark, naturally. And Lestat quickly explained to me that I must not let the police see me, even in minimal light, especially not with my body in its present remarkable state. So I talked to them in the avenue of oaks before the plantation house, ignoring their request that we go inside. And I explained that I'd been to Pt.2 the night before, and that the blind old man was my guest, and as for the overseer, he had not been there, but he had gone to New Orleans on business. And after that was settled, during which my new detachment served me admirably, I had the problem of the plantation itself. My slaves were in a state of complete confusion. No work had been done all day. We had a large plant then for the making of the indigo dye. And as the overseer's management had been most important, but I had several extremely intelligent slaves who might have done this job just as well for a long time before. If I had recognized their intelligence and not feared their appearance and manner, I studied them clearly now and gave the management of things over to them. To the best I gave the overseer's house on a promise. 2 of the young men were brought back into the house from the fields to care for Lestat's father, and I told them I wanted as much privacy as possible, and that they would, all of them, be rewarded not only for service but for leaving me and Lestat absolutely alone. I did not realize at the time that these slaves would be the first and possibly only ones to ever suspect Lestat and I were not ordinary creatures. I failed to realize that their experience with the supernatural was far greater than that of white men. It was my own inexperience, and I still thought of them as childlike savages, barely domesticated by slavery. I made a bad mistake, but let me keep to my story. I was going to tell you about my first kill. Lestat bungled it with his characteristic lack of common sense. Bungled it? Asked the boy. I should never have started with human beings, but this was something I had to learn by myself. Lestat had us plunge headlong into the swamps right after the police and slaves were settled, and it was very late, and the slave cabins were completely dark. We soon lost sight of the lights of Pt.2 altogether, and I became very agitated. It was the same thing again. Remembered fears, confusion, and Lestat, had he any native intelligence, might have explained things to me patiently and gently, that I had no need to fear the swamps, that the snakes and the insects I was utterly invulnerable, that I must concentrate on my new ability to see in total darkness. Instead, he harassed me with my condemnations. He was concerned only with our victims, with finishing my initiation and getting on with it. And when we finally came upon our victims, he rushed me into action. They were a small camp of runaway slaves. Lestat had visited them before and picked off perhaps a fourth of their number by watching from the dark, for one of them to leave the fire, or by taking them in their sleep. They knew absolutely nothing of Lestat's presence, and we had to watch for well over an hour before one of the men, they were all men, finally left the clearing and just a few paces into the trees. He unhooked his pants now and attended to the ordinary physical necessity, and as he turned to go, Lestat shook me and said, "Take him." The vampire smiled at the boy's wide eyes, and I think I was about as horror-struck as you would be. He said, "But I don't know how that I might kill animals instead of humans." But I said quickly, "I could not possibly take him," and the slave heard me speak, and he turned his back to the distant fire and peered into the dark, and quickly and silently, as he drew a long knife out of his belt. He was naked except for the pants and belt, a tall, strong-armed, sleek young man, and he said something in the French patois. And then he stepped forward, and I realized that, though I saw him clearly in the dark, he could not see me. Lestat stepped in back of him with a swiftness that baffled me, and he got a hold around his neck while he pinned his left arm, and the slave cried out and tried to throw Lestat off. He sank his teeth now, and the slave froze as if from snakebite, and he sank into his knees, and Lestat fed fast, and the other slaves came running. "You sicken me," he said. And when he got back to me, it was as if we were insects utterly camouflaged into the night, watching the slaves move oblivious to us, discover the wounded man, drag him drag him back, fan out into the foliage, searching for the attacker. "Come on, we have to get another one before they all return to camp," he said. And quickly, we set off after one man who was separated from the others, and I still feel terribly agitated, convinced I couldn't bring myself to attack, and feeling no urge to do so. There were many things, as I mentioned, which Lestat may have said or done. He may have made the experience rich in so many ways, but he did not. "What could he have done?" the boy asked. "What do you mean?" "Killing is no ordinary act," said the vampire. "One doesn't simply glut oneself on blood." He shook his head. "It is the experience of another's life for certain, and often the experience of loss of that life through the blood, and slowly it is again and again the experience of the loss of my own life, which I experienced when I sucked the blood from Lestat's wrist and felt his heart pound with my heart. It is again and again a celebration of that experience, because for vampires, that is the ultimate experience." He said this most seriously, as if he were arguing with someone who held a different view. I don't think Lestat ever appreciated that, though. How he could not, I don't know. Let me say he appreciated something, but very little. I think of what there is to know in any event. He took no pains to remind me of what I felt when I clamped onto someone's wrist for life itself, and wouldn't let go, or to pick and choose a place for me where I might experience my kill with some measure of quiet dignity. He rushed headlong through the encounter as if it were something to put behind us as quickly as possible. Like so many yards of the road, and once he had caught that slave, he gagged him and held him, baring his neck. "Do it," he said. "You can't turn back now." Overcome with revulsion and weak with frustration, I obeyed, and I knelt beside the bent, struggling man, and clamping both my hands on his shoulders, I went into his neck. My teeth had only just begun to change, and I had to tear into his flesh, not puncture it. But once the wound was made, the blood flowed, and once that happened, once I was locked to it, drinking, all else vanished. Lestat and the swamp and the noise and the distant camp meant nothing. Lestat may have been an insect, buzzing, lighting, and then vanishing in significance. The insect mesmerized me, and the warm struggling of the man was soothing to the tension of my hands, and there came the beating of the drum again, which was the drumbeat of his heart, only this time in perfect rhythm with the drumbeat of my own heart, the two resounding in every fiber of my being, until the beat began to grow slower and slower, so much that it was a soft rumble that threatened to go without end, and I was drowsing, falling into weightlessness, and then Lestat pulled me back. "He's dead, you idiot," he said with his characteristic charm intact. "You don't drink after they're dead. Understand that." I was in a frenzy for a moment, not myself, insisting to him that the man's heart still had beat, and I was in agony to clamp onto him again. I ran my hands over his chest, and I grabbed at his wrist, and I could have cut into his wrist if Lestat hadn't pulled me to my feet and slapped my face. This slap was astonishing. It was not painful in the ordinary way. It was a sensational shock of another sort, a rapping of the senses, so that I spun in confusion and forgot myself, helpless and staring, my back against a cypress in the night, pulsing with insects in my ears. "You'll die if you do that," Lestat was saying. "He'll suck you right down into the death with him if you cling to him in death. And now, you've drunk too much. Besides, you'll be ill." The voice grated on me, and I had urged to throw myself on him suddenly, but I was feeling just what he said. There was a grinding pain in my stomach, as if some whirlpool were sucking my insides into itself. It was the blood passing too rapidly to my own blood, but I didn't know it. Lestat moved through the night like a cat, and I followed him, my head throbbing, this pain in my stomach no better, when we reached the house of Pt.2, and as we sat at the table in the parlor, Lestat dealing a game of solitaire on the polished wood, I sat there staring at him with contempt. He was a numbing nonsense. "And I would get used to killing," he said. "It would be nothing. I must not allow myself to be shaken," and I was reacting too much, as if the mortal coil had not been shaken off. I would become accustomed to things all too quickly. "Do you think so?" I asked him finally. I really had no interest in this answer, and I understood now the difference between us. For me, the experience of killing had been cataclysmic. So had that of the sucking of Lestat's wrist. These experiences so overwhelmed and so changed my point of view of everything around me, from the single picture of my brother on the parlor wall to the sight of a single star on the topmost pane of the French window, that I could not imagine another vampire taking them for granted. I was altered permanently, I knew it, and what I felt most profoundly for everything, even the sound of the playing cards being laid down one by one upon the shining rows of the solitaire, was respect. Lestat felt the opposite, where he felt nothing. He was the sow's ear out of which nothing fine could be made, and as boring as a mortal and as trivial and unhappy as a mortal, he chattered over the game, belittling my experience, utterly locked against the possibility of any experience of his own. And by morning, I realized that I was his complete superior, and I had been sadly cheated in having him for a teacher. He must guide me through the necessary lessons, if there were any real lessons, and I must tolerate him in a frame of mind which was blasphemous to life itself. And I felt cold towards him. I had no contempt and superiority, only a hunger for new experience, for that which was beautiful and as devastating as my kill. And I saw, as if it were to maximize every experience available to me, I must exert my own powers over my learning. Lestat was of no use, and it was past midnight when I finally rose out of the chair and went up to my gallery. The moon was large over the cypresses, and the candlelight poured from the open doors. The thick plastered pillars and the walls of the house had been freshly whitewashed, and the floorboards freshly swept, and a summer rain had left the night clean and sparkling with drops of water. And I leaned against the end pillar of the gallery, my head touching the soft tendrils of a jasmine which grew there in constant battle with the wisteria. And I thought of what lay before me throughout the world and throughout time, and resolved to go about it delicately and reverently, learning that from which Each thing would take me best to another. What this meant, I wasn't sure of myself. Do you understand me when I say I did not wish to rush headlong into experience? That what I felt as a vampire was far too powerful to be wasted. And I think that's where we'll stop for the day. I'm really grateful for all of you, and I'm happy to get to share some of my favorite stories with you. As always, I hope you have a good day, a good night, a good now, and as always,